Welcome back to Trauma Lens Care. In this second video, we want to talk about how trauma affects the brain. One of, I guess I would call this a hockey stick moment in my parenting, which is when I realized and saw a change in how I saw children and trauma, was with one of our very first placements. We had a 5-year-old boy come to live in our home, and as is the nature of foster care, a lot of times you don't know history. And this child and his sister, we really actually were given zero history. And so they were dropped off and we're kind of starting at ground zero. And being a brand new foster parent, I went into this ready to love them well and parent them like I had parented my biological children. I remember in particular one incident. I had made cupcakes for all of our kids to have after dinner. And I had the cupcakes on the counter, and I told all the kids, don't eat the cupcakes, they're for after dinner. And I know all of you are smiling right now because you know where this is going. I left the room to do laundry because at my house there's always laundry to be done. And when I came back in, this little boy, he was standing there with 2 cupcakes and chocolate all over his face. And I rounded the corner, and automatically I was upset because I had told them, you are not to eat those cupcakes. And so what did I do? I asked him, I said, did you eat the cupcakes? And I know all of you know what his answer was. He said no. He looked at me and he said, no. And I then proceeded to argue with him. I said, you're holding the cupcakes. They're all over your face. You ate the cupcakes. And his face, again, was completely just blunt. And he said, I didn't eat the cupcakes. And what I learned in that moment is what is the science behind trauma in the brain. And so I'm going to have my husband Darren explain to you, because he is the science teacher, exactly what is happening in the brain of children when it has been affected by trauma.
So you hear a lot about the term regulation these days and co-regulation. And so to take that term that I think we hear a lot and show how this works, the brain is organized. You can kind of look at it as first floor, second floor, third floor. And that first floor sometimes is referred to as the basement. Karen Purvis liked to call it that. The basement of the brain is all about where your survival mode comes from. There's life support going on here, right? Regulation of breathing and heart rates and stuff. That's in the basement. You have that first floor, middle area of the brain, which is where we deal with our emotions. The emotional brain, which processes all kinds of sensory information. And then the top part of the brain, which is the thinking brain, right? The cerebral cortex. And so that part of the brain is the part of the brain that learns, that remembers, that helps us have personality and have executive function skills and be able to regulate ourselves. Well, so the reason why that's a little bit important is because we have to talk about the stress response. And so when we have a stress response, what happens in our brain is that the top floor, the part of the brain that's thinking, that is analyzing and all that, goes offline. It's like the connection to that floor is cut. And so what stress does is it drops our thinking out of that thinking brain and into our emotional brain and into our survival brain. And so now we just react. And even though caught with 2 cupcakes and chocolate on his face, he still lied. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because he had to know he was caught. But it doesn't make sense because he wasn't thinking clearly, because the stress had changed the way his brain had worked. And so if we go back to that discussion on developmental trauma, so as children are developing in utero, right, so from the very beginning, in utero till about 18 months, and we go through this process of attachment. Usually it's with mom, hopefully with mom and dad. There's this period of time where bonding occurs, and we know that in utero experience, hopefully mom is not stressed out and has a good pregnancy, and the birth goes well, and the first 18 months are solid, and there's love and affection that goes, and mom and dad are pouring into that child, right? Like that's kind of how we're designed to develop. And what that does is it allows the brain to develop connections, appropriate connections, and build a framework for understanding the world. And so in the brain, a child's brain, if they've been loved and cared for and their needs have been met, that process of serve and return, right? A baby cries and mom meets the need, and that just goes on and on and on. And then baby learns like, okay, the world is predictable and the world is safe and somebody's going to meet my needs and I'm loved. And through that process, they develop a regulatory system. Their brain learns appropriately how to not live in survival brain, but then start to develop a good emotional brain and then develop into the thinking brain. Now that takes years and years. We know that goes on until we're about 25. But so when you see developmental trauma, what happens is it gets in the way of that appropriate development. And so then the brain just is not going to function the way it should. And so we see reactions, we see kids stuck in their emotions, right? A kid who doesn't act their age, and their brain can't regulate in light of stress. And obviously we know in school stress is a really big deal. We have social anxiety, we have conflict with peers, we have anxiety from academics. I mean, kids are just stressed out all the time. And so you and I as teachers, we have to handle our own stress, and we have to help our students regulate themselves in a really stressful environment. So why this is so critical is our kids are going to experience stress, and if they have developmental trauma, they're not going to react to that stress very well.
And so what we were looking at with this young boy in our home is understanding that he had a very, very rocky in utero experience in first several years. And so what happened in that moment when I confronted him was the amygdala in his brain, the alarm system, basically went off and told him there's danger. It went to the hippocampus, which stores memory. And the worst memory that he had was about to happen again. He had had horrible things happen to him, and they were about to happen again, because that's what the brain does in the child. In order to survive, the minute it's triggered, it's going to go back to that traumatic event, and it's going to happen again. It doesn't make sense because he's not using the thinking brain. And so what does this look like in your classroom? This looks like kids that can lie, and they believe what they're saying. This looks like big behaviors. This looks like emotional and chronological age not matching. This looks like rewards and consequences not working. How do we do this? How do we teach when we have students in this place? Well, we have to help them not go there in the first place. And what's hard about that is that intrinsically a classroom is always transitioning and always moving. And so anytime you transition or introduce something new or novel, what is happening with that information is that it first filters through the bottom part of the brain, the first floor. Students who have trauma, it's going to get stuck there unless you co-regulate or help them move past that. And so one of the things that we like to teach is windows of tolerance. Windows of tolerance helps us understand stress response in not only our students, but in ourselves, and how we move our kids from the basement of the brain up to the thinking brain so that we aren't stuck in this, did you take the cupcakes? Because what we like to say is, in that moment, he had a little brain. Well, I also had a little brain, and two little brains fighting is not a good thing. And so let's move into what is called the windows of tolerance.
In this conversation about windows of tolerance, and we're going to go back and reference what we said about stress. Windows of tolerance, this guy named Dan Siegel, who's really amazing psychiatrist. He's done a lot of work in this field. You can read a lot of his books and learn some really good stuff. Dan Siegel talks about this idea of a window of tolerance, and tolerance refers to our ability to tolerate stress. And so that conversation about development and attachment and all that, that is how we develop a window that grows larger. And so as we are developing and we build good relationships with our parents or caregivers, and we become well regulated, and so our brain develops a larger and larger window of being able to handle stress. And I think all of us could recognize that we know people who just handle stress really well, and we know people who really don't handle stress well. And so how is that possible? Why are some people just stress more and some people stress less? Well, there's a real reason, and it's not just choice. It's a function of the brain. And so windows of tolerance, this idea that we have this ability to tolerate stress, and it can change. And so when we use this as a picture to look at our students of how they handle stress, I think it's just a good visual for teachers to be able to always reference to when you see a child's behavior that they might be leaving that window of tolerance and something is pushing them, stressing them out.
So what we understand is that how wide your window is or how narrow it is, a lot of that is defined by your early attachments. We know that the attachment process gives us the ability to regulate ourselves in the world and also to learn to trust others and to trust the predictability of a world. And so when we are thinking about our students, we know that when we are stressed out or a student is stressed out, probably what we would call a neurotypical student or a well-attached student is going to have stressful things like an exam or a transition, and then come back down and maybe it's just a lull and you're doing storybook time, and then maybe it's cafeteria time and there's some social anxiety, but for the most part, they're going to stay within their window. Well, when you are working with students who have had trauma or who might be struggling with some really hard things, you might see them leave their window. And so the same thing could happen where there's a quiz or a transition and you see them doing this. Now, what does it look like to leave your window? So what we understand is that people do typically one of two things. They become hyper-vigilant, which looks like in a student in your classroom, anger, popping off, can't sit in their seat, climbing the walls. Those are those students that are just look like they are revved with their gas pedal to the floor in the car in neutral. They're just spinning, spinning, spinning. All right? The opposite of that is hypovigilance. Now, hypovigilance looks like blunt affect, daydreaming out the window. We call it the 1,000-yard stare, where they're just seeing through you. They're not achieving to their level of ability. In the classroom, hypervigilance is oftentimes diagnosed as ADD or ADHD. Hypovigilance is oftentimes not caught because this is not a behavior problem student. This is a student that you're constantly trying to get motivated to do something. And so we know that 70% of boys tend to be hyper-vigilant and 70% of girls tend to go hypo-vigilant. And so when you think about this in your classroom and you see students who are hyper-vigilant or hypo-vigilant, what you're looking at is ways to widen their window.
Yeah, so I think what we need to see in this is, when we talk about how different people handle stress in different ways, some people have a large window, like they can tolerate a real large amount of stress and they're okay. And then there are other people who can't. They can handle much less stress. So when we talk about this process in the classroom of evaluating our students, getting to know them, and maybe they have trauma in their background, you will see kids whose window is very small. And so they will go out of that window very easily. You could just say, hey, stop what you're doing. We're going to do something else. And you just transition and they lose it. They freak out. Like that stresses them out and they can't handle it. And so I think what we have to recognize is that is not a choice for them. Their brain is on autopilot at that point. And so when they have a stress response and the thinking brain goes offline, they're going to say things, they're going to do things you're not going to like. And teachers, then we have to deal with some conflict in that. And so I think if you look at each of your students and you recognize their window might be really small, then you can start to manage their stress differently. And so I think then there's a lot of strategies we use in the classroom for helping keep students in that window. And what we don't want to see ever, which does happen, is kids get stuck out of their window. So they get, some stressful event happens, they can't handle stress well, and they move out and they go, let's say, hypervigilant. Their strategy to survive, in essence, their brain says, I just need to be aggressive and angry. And that becomes their personality all the time. They're like literally living up in that hypervigilant state. And we don't want that. Like we can't teach that. If the thinking brain is offline, we're going to have a really hard time trying to teach that student.
And so what do we do with our students who are continually going hyper or hypovigilant? Because what happens if we don't intervene, it doesn't just go away. What we understand is that hypervigilance, when it is not met, when the need's not met, and we don't teach children how to move back into their window, hypervigilance ends up turning into conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, drug use, all those things. Hypovigilance tends to move towards self-harm, like cutting and suicidal ideation or suicide. And so what we look to do is help people learn to stay in their windows, and this is adults as well. When I teach in the jail, there's a very interesting study where there's a correlation between hyper and hypovigilance and drug of choice. And so I always start out and I ask the inmates if they actually believe that they chose the drug that they use, because most addicts or substance using individuals actually believe that they chose their drug. Well, I surmise that their drug chose them because of the way they move out of their window. Now, what we have found is that those who are hypervigilant in nature, and we all have a predisposition towards one or the other, or both. Those who are hypervigilant in nature typically choose a drug that's an upper because it brings them back down into their window. Those who are hypovigilant in nature choose a drug that's a downer because it moves them into their window. And it seems opposite of what you would believe, but that's how it works. Now, what's super interesting is that studies have shown that the more trauma someone has, they tend to go both ways. They'll be hypervigilant one moment and hypovigilant another moment because it's an adaptive survival method. Those are our poly drug users. Those are the ones that are choosing the drug in the moment to match which section of the window they go out of. Well, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we figure out strategies to help our students widen their window and stay within their window so they don't turn to what we call maladaptive strategies to survive, which is drug use or criminality or basically not functioning in society because they're not regulating themselves. How do we widen our students' window of tolerance or help them stay within their window? Earlier, we talked about how there are two things that change the brain: relationship and environment. A lot of times when we first start in a classroom, or if we have 150 students, we can't leverage relationship. And so we need to leverage environment. And that is by dosing stress and setting up the environment to act as a calming place for the brain. When you are looking at your classroom, this is all about policies and procedures. When your students walk in, do they know what they're supposed to do? Are you prepping them for transitions? Is there a schedule on the board? In some ways, the beginning of your class should look very same, almost Groundhog Day. That's how you calm a brain. When a student knows that something's predictable and the same, then the brain starts out in a calm place, and then I'm going to dose stress. I'm going to dose stress by telling them, in 2 minutes, we are going to do this. And so that they're prepared for the new or novel thing that's going to be introduced. Now, as they gain trust with you, then what's going to happen is you're then going to be able to leverage and utilize relationship. All right? But in the beginning, environment is huge. And so the room is going to be calm. I'm not going to have a lot of things on the wall. I'm going to transition with warnings. I'm going to have schedules on the board. I'm going to have things that help my student be successful in the moment, and then I start dosing stress. Another strategy I used an egg timer to let them know, okay, 2 minutes, things are going to change. When the bell dings, this is what you will do. And what that did was it helped students' brains to be prepared for transition, and it told them what to do next.
The other thing we have to recognize is our own window. And Stacy and I will say, we have 7 kids, we have 5 adopted children, And so we deal with stress a lot, and we deal with small windows, and we deal with emotions a lot. And so we will say to each other sometimes, Ma, I'm out of my window right now. I need to go sit down somewhere quiet. I need to regulate myself. And I think it's just a good way for us to recognize in ourselves as teachers, the day is stressful. And I bet all of us that are watching this, everybody would know at the end of the day, when that bell goes off and the kids go home, there's just this big sigh of relief. There's like this big letdown emotionally, like you can finally relax because the day is a stressful day. And so as the day goes on, I think you need to be able to see your stress levels and your stress response. And if you start to move out of your window, when a child in your class, a student does something that causes a stress response in you, you've got to be able to take a breath and calm your body down so that you can appropriately deal with that student. You don't want to end up in this big conflict. And what I've seen working with students and working with teachers, I spent part of my career in a neat role and working with kids with trauma and in helping teachers develop good strategies for working with students. And so what I saw when I had teachers, one particular, she struggled with PTSD. She had experienced some really challenging things in her adult life. And so when she would interact with her students, and she knew she had PTSD, we talked about this a lot. She was getting help with that. But when something would happen during the day, an event, a student would say something, she would have a response, a stress response that was not appropriate, that wasn't good. And she knew it. And so she had to work on that on a constant thing. And I think all of us have those times when a student does something and it really wants to set us off. And so if we recognize our window, we might be leaving our window. It's a good time for us to learn some of those mindfulness strategies. Take a deep breath, say, I need to talk to you about that, but I'm going to wait a couple minutes because I need to get myself regulated so that we don't have an escalation. We can actually have a de-escalation of that incident.
I also think that understanding that someone who is hypervigilant, if you notice that the drug of choice for inmates that were hypervigilant were uppers, okay? Think about students who present with ADHD symptoms. What do we utilize to bring them down? We use Ritalin, right? That's an upper, right? So what's more effective in a student that's really dealing with trauma and not ADHD is not maybe, oh, let's sit down and be calm, okay? For me, I have a high number of ACEs from childhood. I need to go for a run. I need to do something physical because that's what keeps me in my window. So when I'm feeling stressed, I'm going to do things that are going to help me feel active and productive. Now, a lot of people that are hypovigilant, they tend to want to do the opposite. I want to be calmed. I want a calming blanket. I want to sit and garden, those kind of things. So in your classroom, think about using fidgets or heavy work or things like that for your students who are hypervigilant. And then for your students who are hypovigilant, maybe a weighted lap blanket or maybe calming music or those kind of things. You guys are creative and you're teachers, and I don't need to tell you how to, the strategies to use with each student, but it is important to recognize that telling a hypervigilant student to sit and be calm is actually counterproductive to what is going to be helpful to them in the classroom. So I want to end real quick with a cupcake story, and I want to talk about how what I learned from that is that we know environment and relationship changes the brain. And in that moment, we had two small brains battling each other about cupcakes. He was going to lie to survive. So what could I have done differently? Did I have a relationship with this kid? I did not. He'd been in my home for a week. I needed to leverage and utilize environment. I should have never had the cupcakes out on the counter. The child had food issues. Who cared about the cupcakes? It was never about the cupcakes. In that moment, I needed to see beyond the cupcake to the needs of the child. So when you guys are dealing with behaviors in their classroom, you have to look beyond the cupcakes. You have to look beyond the big stuff that's in front of you and see underneath for what is the need that needs to be met.